In this video, I go over exactly how to set up my Sony a7 III out of the box. I go over all the basics menu setting by menu setting so that you can just follow along and set up your camera live with me as I go along. Sometimes the camera manual doesn't do a very good job explaining what each individual setting does, and those are the questions that I answer today. Even though this is not a fully in-depth video on each of the menu settings and why you should be doing it, it does get you from start to finish to the point where you can just pick up this thing and start filming today. This is directly out of the box. I just took it out and I haven't done anything to it. It did get shipped with the most recent firmware, but just double check it against the manufacturer's website to make sure that you are upgraded to the latest firmware. So that's your step one, and then from there, let's dive into each of the different settings. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to attach a lens, because without attaching a lens, we won't have access to certain menu settings. So in order to enable that, let's just attach one real quick. And just to make things easy, I'm just using the lens that it's shipped with, which is just this 50mm prime. All right, so now that we have the lens attached, we can go ahead and turn it on up here. Another thing is to make sure that you have it on the film mode and not on a photographer mode, because if you're on this mode, you're gonna be like, where did my menu settings go? How come I'm not seeing the same thing? So just switch to this and then we'll all be together on the same page. To go through the menu, you just use the scroll wheel on the side to click back and forth. So we're going to start with image 1, and there are 14 pages to just video 1. The first thing that you're going to notice is that we have raw type compressed or uncompressed. This one you always want to use uncompressed for the maximum quality. If you do want to do any sort of compression, you should probably just do that in post-production. The rest you cannot pay attention to. JPEG image size is fine, just to have it set to the 24 megapixels. Okay, next you have aspect ratio, and this one is important because right now by default it's a 3:2, which is better for photography. If you are shooting something for social media, this might be a great format, but for now we want to just switch it to the standard 16:9, which I think is a bit more universal. The bottom one is probably a little intimidating if you are not familiar with film. I started off shooting on 16mm film and 35mm film, so the idea of a super 35mm sensor is very common to me. But I think if you come from a DSLR background or a beginner's background, you're probably like, what is APS-C Super 35? And the answer is, it's just the format in which the camera captures on the sensor. I actually have a diagram right here that you can take a look at and you can see how big that format is. Don't overthink this too much if you've never used a DSLR before. All you have to do is click on it and make sure that you set it to auto, because if you are using a specific type of lens that you need to adapt to it, it determines where it's going to capture in the frame. Page 2, the most important things to look at are high ISO and R. This is the noise reduction, and so you just want to leave it at normal. I've seen tests done where if you try to digitally remove the noise in camera, it tends to make more grain and make the footage look worse. So if you're going to do something like this, probably do that in post-production as well. Page 3, you can pretty much ignore everything here. Page 4, same thing. And then page 5, continuous autofocus, or you can do single shot autofocus. It depends on, for example, if you're using a gimbal and you want it to be continuous autofocus. These are just preferences. Same thing with the focus area. You can just go wide or have it centered, and this is really based off of whether you're tracking an environment or a face or a car. You can go to focus area and make a flexible spot, and then in focus settings you can actually determine where you want it to be. Page 6, I would say don't mess with any of this. In terms of autofocus tracking sensor, you can decide if you want it to rack focus really quickly onto something. Leaving it at 3 standard is pretty normal. On page 9, we have the ISO, and this is something that you can access a little more quickly through the function button on the back of your camera. A good idea is to just stay around the 100 to 400 range. Next is the white balance. We don't want to leave this on auto because it can get really frustrating. So I would say the most important thing is to make sure that you have the white balance set to the color temperature inside your environment, which is based on the lights. Daylight is very blue, tungsten is very golden, and the reason why is because if you have it set to auto and you have a pure white wall and then something like my shirt, which is cream colored, the camera's not going to understand what is color temperature and what is like the actual physical color of the object. And so if I were to pan from that bright white wall to my cream shirt, it actually might change the whole color temperature because it doesn't understand what is pure white. But if you tell it what is pure white and you say, hey, anything that is exactly identical to this should be pure white, everything else, creams, tans, soft blues, like go ahead and ignore all that, then you'll end up with a much more consistent color temperature quality to the images that you capture. We also have different types of creative styles. I do not use these, and the main reason why is because I like to shoot normal and then do all my LUTs and correction in post. But for this one, for example, the creative style, there's one called Autumn Leaves. It's very golden. The reason why I don't use this is because I think you should balance the color depending on your environment, your subject, your tone, and not just let the camera do that for you. This could be really fun if you're just shooting, something casual and you're like, hey, I want to see how golden this is, or I want this to be more blue tones. But it tends to do it falsely, and so I would say it's a much better practice to do it in post-production. All right, next is picture effect. I have not played with these, but just looking at them, they're crazy. It reminds me of Photoshop where you just like slap on these crazy effects and you're like, woo, posterization. But I would just ignore that because again, it's something you can do in post-production. I don't know why they have it on this camera. This is a very professional camera, but to each their own. Next is picture profile. This is where people, I will say in advance, this is where people start to get a little crazy. There is no correct answer to how you want to capture your video. You don't have to shoot in S-Log2. You don't have to shoot in S-Log3. There's no issues with shooting in Cine 4, but people can get really intense about what they say is the best setting. And I would say the best setting is the one that matches exactly what you're trying to capture and it fits the needs of your film shoot. That's about it. So a lot of people like to shoot in S-Log2, which is picture profile number 2 by default on this camera. But I would say unless you know how to shoot S-Log, probably avoid it. S-Log2 requires a very specific type of workflow. You have to overexpose the shot. You also have to do a lot in color correcting. And there are a bunch of other little things like if your environment is not very bright, if it's a darker environment, this is a very difficult log to shoot in. I personally shoot in the first picture profile, which is Cine 4, and I guess that's surprising to some people because they're like, what, a film professor and a professional film director? You shoot all your stuff in Cine 4? And the answer is no, not always, because if I use a bigger camera, which is what I use for professional film shoots, I'm not going to be shooting in Cine 4. I'm going to be shooting in S-Log because I have a director of photography who's there to help me, and I have a gaffer who can light the set perfectly. But doing this on my own, especially these YouTube channels, I don't have time to go in post-production and perfectly color correct every single video. So for me, Cine 4 is absolutely beautiful. This is currently being shot in Cine 4, and I think it serves its purpose. It takes a lot of work off of me. I don't have to color correct everything. I mean, to be honest, I color correct footage all day long. I don't want to do it for my YouTube channel. Pick something that works for you. I personally like Cine 4, which is picture profile number 1, but there's also picture profile number 3, which is S-Log3, a little bit of a different workflow from S-Log2. Another popular one is if you go down to picture profile number 10, this one is the HLG3 picture profile. It's pretty similar to the Cine 4. I would say the only difference is the style. If you like a lot more contrast and brighter highlights and deeper blacks, I would go with this one, but I like more of a matte even look to my footage, so that's why I use the Cine 4. Page 13, this is all for autofocus, and I would say this is more important if you're going to use something like a gimbal rather than if you're just, point and shooting. So I would say the most important thing is manual focus assist on. I would say yes, turn that on, and then go to the peak settings, and this will put a red line around everything that is in focus. And this is really great because this is a tiny LCD screen, so unless you have an external monitor, it becomes really difficult to be like, I don't know, is that shot in focus? I can't really tell. I'm outside, I'm blinded by the sunlight, or it's really dark in here and I can't tell. And so me being blind as a bat, like to use the different settings here. So I always have it set to mid. The peaking color I have red because there's not much red in nature, and I ended up using that. All right, so now we're moving on to the purple tab, which is the second one at the top, and it's called Movie 1. This is a very important page, so I will take my time on this one to go through and explain everything. The first one is exposure mode, and I would make this manual because, again, as much as we can do the work ourselves rather than having the camera do it, it's going to be better. We have the file format, and this is really determined by your personal workflow. Again, people can get a little crazy about saying like, I've got to shoot 4K, or I have to shoot in 8K, or like, what are you doing shooting in 1080? But there is a reason for everything. And again, there's no right answers, you guys. So what's good about 4K is that you're able to capture a lot of detail and a lot of data, which is perfect for something like environments, the city, nature shots. But I would say that you may not always want to shoot in 4K for people, especially when I do interviews. In particular, the ladies are very, very nervous about being shot in 4K because it shows a lot of their pores and their wrinkles. So a lot of times I will opt for 1080p if I know it's going on their website or social media, because at that point it's going to be compressed by the internet anyway, and you will lose a little bit of data. But what's nice is at least if I export it in a true 1080, it will still kind of smooth out their pores and their wrinkles. I know it sounds really silly, but it does help significantly with kind of beautifying the ladies and making sure their little hair isn't flying away, or making sure that their face looks nice and their makeup looks smooth. And so the answer is 4K is not always the right way to do that. Now, if you're shooting action, 4K is really cool because you can capture a lot of detail. But something that you should note on this camera, which is not true on all cameras, is that on the a7 III you can only shoot 4K at lower frame rates. You can't do 120 frames a second. You have to go down to 1080. So you have to think about that in terms of workflow. You might need to do a combination of both, or you might just shoot 1080 across the board. I will say that shooting in 4K and compressing it down to 1080 will always look better than shooting in native 1080. So that is something else to consider. Another pet peeve is people always say, hey, shoot in 4K and then punch in and post to make a medium shot. And this is also a very bad practice, because if you're punching in, you should be also considering like how the camera lens is going to affect it. Maybe just switching to a 50mm instead of just moving in the camera with 4K and punching in post. There are correct workflows to do this. I wouldn't overthink it if you're a beginner. Just pick a mode, stick with it, and learn to really master that particular workflow. Spent a lot of time talking about that one because I think it's very important. Next is frame rate. Equally important, right? Everybody always says by default you should be shooting 60 frames a second because it captures a lot of detail. But for me, 60 frames a second is extremely distracting, and I just hate it. I hate 60 frames a second. I won't even try and soften my words right here. I really dislike 60 frames a second. And then at the bottom we have proxy recording, which I would say leave that alone. It's something that you should be doing in post-production so that you don't burn through your memory cards. Next, we're on page 2, and this one has autofocus and audio settings. So this is particularly useful if you're running and gunning, or if you want to use a gimbal. I would say for drive speed, I would just leave it at normal, but if you really need a rack focus, like if you're chasing somebody, move that to fast. And then if you go to the tracking sensor, you want that to be responsive or standard. It really just depends on how quickly you want the camera to respond. Next, we have audio recording, and this is just something to keep in mind. My students, I'm looking at you guys. This is the microphone port, and this is the headphone port. Those are two different things. So if you're plugging in your microphone and you're wondering why the audio recording isn't on, it's probably because you plugged it into the headphone port instead. So make sure you plug it into the correct port, and then you go to audio recording and you turn that on. Audio record level. This is to prevent it from peaking, so you want to make sure that you have that set to about 70% peaking. Every microphone is different, so you're just going to have to adjust this yourself. And then we go down to the audio level display. I would say absolutely turn that on so you can make sure that you're getting a signal. You'll see it kind of in the corner. You can do an audio test, say check, check, 1, 2, 3, and just make sure that you can see it peaking. And a lot of times you can't see it right here, but I've got a dead cat on my microphone. So the difference between saying like, hey, this is an internal mic versus it's the external mic might be the difference between you capturing the audio the way you wanted and then finding out in post-production like, oops, I didn't record that right. Page 3 is just a few other little things. I wouldn't spend too much time on this. For example, wind noise reduction on the microphone. I don't really use it because I usually film in a quiet environment, or if I'm running and gunning, a lot of times I just design the sound in post-production because it's very loud outside. Next is marker display. This is really good for if you're a beginner, not so much for if you're a professional. Although the one thing that I do like to use is if I turn it on and then go down to marker settings, I do like having the safety zone on just because you never know. It's really useful, for example, if you want to dip a microphone into the shot and then see like, okay, this is the edge of my safety zone right here. And then you'll be able to see in post-production like, oh yes, I at least cleared this much. Aspect is really useful if you want to shoot in something that's not 16:9, because then instead of having to do something, you know, like tape your LCD screen to be like, it should be within this little section right here, you can just use the guide frames. So for example, you can go all the way up to CinemaScope. You can do the 1.85:1, and that will show you what your guidelines for CinemaScope is. That way you're not doing that silly thing in post-production where you shoot in 16:9 and then you put the black bars on. Don't do that. If you haven't learned the lesson here, it's that you should do everything correctly instead of in post-production. That's really it. You can't fix everything in post, so do as much in the camera settings as possible so that you're not just killing yourself in post-production. Page 4 is also very useful for if you're using the gimbal. At the very bottom, you have steady shot, which I would turn on. And then the steady shot settings, I would set that to manual. And then underneath it, you have the focal length. Tell it what lens that you are using. This is really important because every lens behaves differently. There could be warping on the edges if you're going fisheye versus something that's a lot more zoomed in, like a 50mm lens. And so you do want to tell it because that helps it with the stabilization. So if you take this and you use a lens that has, like for example, Sony's OSS stabilization on it, and then you put that on top of a gimbal, you're going to get these butter smooth shots. It looks so good. Next important setting is page 6, and I would go down to the zebra setting. This shows you what highlights are blown out on camera, and this is really good for beginners because you probably haven't trained your eye yet to see what is overexposed and what isn't. And if you're shooting an S-Log, this is really useful because it helps you do that false overexposure without completely blowing out the entire thing. So you can go to zebra setting and you can turn that on, and I like to set to about 80. The main reason why is because the Sony tends to be a little paranoid. It errs on the side of caution when telling you what's overexposed. What I found is a lot of times the camera will tell me this is overexposed, and in post-production I'm like, no, it wasn't. It was close to being almost overexposed, but not really. So pretty much anything that's a 10% gray or close to pure white, it will mark as overexposed. So what I would do is just take it down a little bit and just treat this as more like guidelines rather than an actual scientific data of saying like, this is completely blown out. Page 8, you can set up custom keys. This is dependent on the user, so I'm not going to show you how to do this, but at the very top of the camera, you have C1, C2, and C3, and these are places where you can have custom things. For example, the wheel up front controls the f-stop, but maybe you don't like that. Maybe you want to cycle through using C1. Maybe you want C1 to be your white balance. So these are all different things that you can program. I haven't gotten around to it, and I don't really program the buttons like that. I'm kind of a old-fashioned, just gonna click through the menu and hit the function button and do it. I don't want to accidentally hit buttons at the top because a lot of times when I'm running and gunning, it's too easy for me to accidentally hit this, which is actually one of the main reasons why I don't use the A7R series. It's because the record button is on the corner, and me holding the camera, I've hit the record button, and I've also stopped the record so many times. So I'm really glad that this camera has this little indented part, so it's less likely for me to accidentally turn the camera off while I'm running around chasing wildlife through the woods. And so for that reason, I don't program any custom buttons because I don't want to accidentally hit anything. The next menu is the green one at the top, and it's the network function. And this is such a cool addition to this camera. Oh my goodness. It's so great. You can't see it right here, but I have this whole setup where I've got my smartphone and my laptop so I can preview what I'm filming in 4K, which is not something that's easy to do with this camera. A lot of times you can preview it, but you have to shoot in 1080. You're not allowed to record in 4K. And so having this send to smartphone is the coolest thing ever. So on this menu, if you want to do that and set it up, you just have to go down to control with smartphone and turn that on. And then you can always say always connected or not, it doesn't really matter. But then you go to connection and you're going to start up your Wi-Fi, and it's going to come up with this QR code right here. So then what you do is you just take your smartphone app. You can either use the image app by Sony, or you can use the Camrote, which I actually prefer. I think it's a better app. And then you use the QR setting in order to capture this, and then it automatically connects to each other. It's super simple. It can be a little iffy if you're moving around too much, or like if you have your camera go automatically on turn off mode after 5 minutes on battery savings mode, it can cause some problems. But for the most part, you just control with the smartphone, and it's so great. Like you can't see it right here, but I can automatically change the settings. I can change the f-stop. I can change my ISO, and I can hit start, record, things like that, so that I don't have to go like this and reach behind the camera. Super cool function. The second page is where you're going to set up your Wi-Fi settings in your house if you want to use that. Same with the Bluetooth to transfer to your laptop. I always use just a traditional card, but I do like to use the preview setting here. And then probably the last important thing is setting your device name. You can do the custom one if you want. I don't really care. The camera can just be whatever it's called. The next one, we go to the blue tab, which is Playback, and this has everything to do with what you've already recorded to your SD card. So you can protect files, which I highly recommend. If you have that one shot where you're like, that was so great, I just did a 20-minute take of an interview, you should probably protect it, because I never do this, but some people have the habit of deleting out of the camera. I never do that. I never delete in camera. I always download the SD card, back up everything. I'll decide later if I want it or not. I just burn through SD cards like crazy. I probably own like 20 SD cards. It's a little ridiculous. So I just eat through SD cards like crazy. Good thing there's a dual slot on this one, which is another reason why I bought this camera. Another thing you can do is you can delete. I wouldn't do that, but you can delete stuff if you want. Ugh. But what I would do is I would say just have your settings where you protect what you need, and then just leave everything else alone. Okay, going back to the top, we have in yellow the setup box. There's 7 pages here. So on the first one, I would leave all of this alone. You don't want to falsely change the color on your LCD screen, because then you don't know what you're actually recording. If you make this too bright, then you're looking at the zebra and you're like, I don't know, it looks pretty bright to me. So just leave the screen as it is. This menu only controls what you're seeing on the LCD, not what is being recorded on the SD card. On the next page, you do want display quality to be high. I don't know why you wouldn't want the highest quality LCD screen. Next is the power saver start time, and I just put it at 30 minutes. I hate when the camera turns off and I'm trying to do something, because a lot of times for photography, you're just kind of clicking and shooting, and that's fine. But for video, you need to see live what you're actually doing. So if you have something like my smartphone set up here and you're trying to preview it, and then 30 seconds later you haven't done anything and it just shuts itself off, now you have to reconnect back to your computer. Now you have to reconnect back to your smartphone, to the camera, and it's just a huge hassle. So I put it to 30 minutes. The only thing is it eats a lot of battery, so just understand that. Next is the power temperature savings, and this setting drove me nuts. I actually had to Google this one because I could not for the life of me figure out why my camera was turning itself off in the middle of a film shoot. So I was here in my office, it's 68 degrees, it's winter in Colorado, and I like to keep it really cold in the house because I've got this massive editing suite behind me that has multiple computers and, 3 RAID drive towers and a backup battery and all these lights in the office. And my DSLR kept shutting itself off, and it was driving me nuts until somebody said, make sure to put the setting to high so that the camera tolerates more. It's trying to protect itself, so if it gets anything around like 80 degrees, it shuts itself off, and this was driving me absolutely nuts. So all you have to do is set it to high and problem is solved. So next is the NTSC/PAL selector, and there's a very important clarification here that a lot of beginners make this mistake. This isn't based off of where you go to film. Just because you go to Europe doesn't mean you have to suddenly automatically switch your camera to PAL. So NTSC is for America, United States, and PAL is Asia, Europe, those kind of things. So it doesn't matter that you physically have gone to another country. You don't need to change your camera settings. The only time you need to change this is depending on if you have a client in another country and they want the footage delivered in that format. Then you change to PAL. Other than that, just leave it. If you're here in the United States, leave it as NTSC and then just don't touch that setting. The next page 3 is where you can set up in order to control your camera remotely in addition to the smartphone. So this is where you can add things like an external computer cable in order to preview shots on your laptop, or if you have an IR remote control, which my kit came with but I don't really use because I use my smartphone. And then the 4th page is where you go to set that all up if you are going to use the imaging desktop software. So you can go down to PC remote settings and you can hit PC only, and you can preview it there. Page 5 is just for your own preferences. You can set up your date and time depending on where you live, or you can change it, depending on if you do go to another country. And then if you go down to copyright info, you can put your initials there or your company name. Page 6 has some really interesting features, such as the media record setting. So you can tell the DSLR if you want to film on slot 1 or slot 2. So if you're starting to fill up slot 1 and you don't want to take it out of the actual camera, maybe you're out in the middle of nowhere and you're like, I don't want to lose this SD card, but you do want to prematurely switch to the second SD card slot, you can do that here. And then if you go to recording mode, you can dual record. So for example, if you have another co-editor you're working with and you each want a copy of the SD card, or if you're a little worried something's going to happen and you want to keep a backup, you can simultaneously record here. All right, that is everything for a basic startup guide, just to get you out the door and start filming. Over time, you will develop your own preferences for settings, you will want to change things, but this just gets you out there so that you can just start filming today. Now, if you do want to learn more about the different things that I mentioned in the video, like frame rates, aspect ratios, or lenses, just post in the comments below what you would like to see and I can make a video of it. Congratulations on owning your DSLR or upgrading to this one. I hope you found this useful. Please make sure to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. I release them every single week. And follow me on Instagram. That's where you can DM me with your specific questions and I am more than happy to answer them for you. That's it for this video. Go out there, explore, capture some incredible footage, and I will see you next time.